Joining us for this segment is none other than State Representative Josh Cutler, who is also an author. And we're here to talk today about his new book, The Boston Gentlemen's Mob. I almost just gave it a regular name. Mariah Chapman and the Abolition Riot of 1835. Now, this is not his first book. This is actually his second. Welcome to the conversation, Josh.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be back. Thank you.
So, as I teased, this is your second book. Let's first start off by talking about what is your newest book about, the Boston Gentlemen's Mob?
Sure. Well, actually, I think it's actually easier to flip it around because it kind of one leads into the other. But basically, I wrote a book that came out in 2019 about it's called Town Massacre, and it was about Alexander Hansen, who was a newspaper publisher during the War of 1812 in Baltimore, Maryland. And the town of Hansen, and here in the South Shore that I have the privilege of representing, was named after Alexander Hansen. And I can recall when I first learned that fact, I thought, that's kind of interesting. Why is that? Because, typically around here, most of the town names, come from either, sort of Mother England or Native American names, if you look around. And so, the fact that this town of Hansen was named after a newspaper publisher from Maryland, of all places, struck a chord. And so I thought, there must be a good story there. And, after a few years of kind of noodling on that, I decided, well, I'm going to find out. I'm going to really look into this. And I did. And it was really a fascinating story for me, someone who is in public service, but also had a history of being a newspaper editor before that. So Alexander Hansen was this gentleman who was he was a Federalist. He was had fiery opinions. And was very strident in his views, very much against the War of 1812, and used his newspaper at the time to really attack the administration and the folks that were advocating for the war, and in a really tough way. And it earned him a lot of critics, and especially in the city of Baltimore, which at the time was dominated by what is known as the Democratic Republican Party versus the Federalists. Those were the two political parties at the time. And so Hansen became very unpopular, and a mob attacked his printing press and attacked him on two occasions. And on this subsequent occasion, he was almost killed. In fact, he was tortured very brutally by this mob. Another gentleman, one of his supporters, was actually killed. And so it became it was a brutal incident, really, that happened circa the War of 1812, right as the War of 1812 was beginning. And so Alexander Hansen survived that incident, and he went on and decided to run for Congress. And then later he served in the United States Senate. And in fact, he was one of the youngest U.S. senators in history at the time. And he was, at one time he was compared to a young Daniel Webster, and he was, had a bright future ahead of him as this young Federalist firebrand senator. And sadly, his career and his life kind of took a turn for the worse. He never really fully recovered physically from the attack when he was defending the newspaper. And his own views, he was so strident, so dogmatic in his views that he really had trouble adjusting, I think, to Washington, D.C. and sort of the give and take that's sometimes required for serving in those kinds of positions. So he died at a young age in 1819 and never really sort of fulfilled his promise. But his stand in defense of the freedom of the press and freedom of speech during the War of 1812 really resonated across the country, really, and especially here in New England, which at the time was very much a Federalist hotbed, much like, I guess in some ways like we are today. New England, is sort of has a different political viewpoint than some of the southern states, and I think that was certainly the case then. And Maryland was more of a border state, so it was what we might call a swing state in today's parlance. But Hansen's courage really resonated with folks in Massachusetts, including some of the people that served with him, including Daniel Webster. And so when he passed away, when he died, shortly thereafter, just by coincidence, the town of Hansen, which formerly was part of the town of Pembroke, split off, and the residents in Hansen wanted their own town. They wanted their own township because they felt it was too far to travel to go to town meeting, and so they petitioned the legislature to form their own town, and the legislature approved that, and that happened in 1820. And sort of just by confluence of all these events, the legislature and some of the leading Federalists decided to name the town after Alexander Hansen in his honor for the stand that he took in defense of the freedom of the press as a Federalist icon. So that's a fairly lengthy explanation, but it's a fascinating story of how this came to be. And so I wrote a book about that in 2019, and really enjoyed that process of going through, the writing, the researching part. And, I had to travel to Baltimore, and they have some great historical society resources there that were really helpful to my research. And then obviously, researching the Boston, the local angle. And so anyway, had a lot of fun doing that. It was well received, and we donated all the proceeds to local historical societies. And then when the pandemic came on, and as a local state rep, I'm used to going out every night to different events and community events and such. And so when that wasn't really possible, when everything flipped to Zooms, I decided, well, I would really like to take on another project. And so this sort of became my COVID project, was to write another book. And, I was always interested in this idea of, the whole aspects of the mob and how that intersected with freedom of the press issues and politics. And so it led me to the subject matter for the book that I've just written a book about, which you mentioned, the Boston Gentlemen's Mob. And the subtitle is Mariah Chapman and the Boston Abolitionist Riot of 1835. And really, Kevin, this was about a really unique event that happened here in Boston. This time, the scene was right here in the city of Boston in 1835, as sort of the dawn of the abolitionist movement. The early stages of the abolitionist movement. And Mariah Chapman was a young woman from Weymouth. So again, we have a South Shore connection. And she and a number of other women and some men really took a stand against in support of abolition, against the expansion of slavery and for the immediate emancipation of all enslaved persons. And there was a mob that attacked her and a number of other folks in Boston in the fall of 1835. And so again, I took the book, really took a hard look, deep dive into that particular incident and what happened that day and the ramifications that had on the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts, and really how it resonated across the country. So that was that was a long precursor to how I ended up writing this book.
Yeah. Is this a story that's well known and that's been told before? And also, the way you told the story through multiple sets of eyes and through the key participants in the story.
Yeah, so this is an event that happened October 21st, 1835, and I don't think it's super well known. I wasn't really aware of it. Maybe other folks were more knowledgeable about these things at the time, but it's not super well known. And what's unusual about it, a couple things, is number one, we always think of Massachusetts as sort of being a hotbed of the abolitionist movement and being very progressive on these issues, and that may have been the case later on, but at the time, and this is 1835. At the time, that was not the case, and much of Boston was hostile to the abolitionist movement. In fact, there was an anti-abolitionist meeting that was held at Faneuil Hall in the summer of 1835. That was attended by more than 1,000 people, and many of the leading residents of the city at that time. So it was a very different time. And the other thing that's really interesting about this particular incident, I thought, is that the people the men, it was mostly men who came out and were on the streets demonstrating, were really from the upper classes of Boston for the most part. It was the businessmen, the bankers, the statesmen, the insurance folks, militia members who were out on the streets up in arms about this abolitionist movement. So typically when we think of mob violence or mobs, it's sometimes the lower rung of the economic ladder, but this is really the opposite. And so that was intriguing to me as well. And what I chose to do, Kevin, is the sort of the focus point of a lot of this anger was on a gentleman named William Lloyd Garrison, who is probably a familiar name to a lot of folks listening out there. He was a newspaper publisher, published the Liberator newspaper, which was published in Boston for many, many years, which was sort of the leading voice for abolitionists and against slavery. And William Lloyd Garrison, is a pretty well-known figure. And so what I chose to do is try to sort of highlight the roles of some lesser-known figures. And I ended up focusing on 4 individuals that played a key role in this mob attack on various sides. One of them being Mariah Chapman, who was a young woman from Weymouth who went on to have a really remarkable career. She really, kind of was became more prominent because of her role in this mob attack. Also, a young woman named Susan Paul, who is an African-American woman who's came from a fairly prominent African-American family in Boston at the time. Her dad had helped to found the African Methodist Church, which is still there. It's now a museum up on Beacon Hill. And so she was a member of this women's group that was fighting for abolition, and some other individuals that played a role. So it was kind of fun to kind of look at some of the characters who are lesser well known, but I think and would argue that deserved to be more known because they really played a prominent role in this pivotal historical event. So it was a lot of fun, kind of peeling back the layers and getting details and trying to learn about some of these individuals who played such a big role in this event.
If you're just tuning in, we are speaking with Josh Cutler, talking with him about his book, The Boston Gentleman's Mob, Mariah Chapman and the Abolition Riot of 1835. And he's giving us the key details here. I have to say, do you feel that it was important to share and show the courage that people have, especially when a crime is committed and community leaders just kind of fail to step in?
Yeah, so that was another interesting aspect of this, Kevin, is that the mayor at the time was Mayor Lyman, and he he was a very popular figure in the city. He was a very benevolent person, and he donated a lot of money to charity. He'd done a lot of good things. He helped to help bring fresh water to the city, which was a big deal at the time. And but he was very ambivalent, or some might say even hostile to the abolitionists. Again, many folks in the city, many of the leading residents in the city, they for the most part, they did not support slavery, the enslavement of individuals, but they also were hostile to the abolitionists because they were, some of them felt that the immediate abolishment of slavery could lead to civil war and would upset some of their mercantile relations with southern states. That was a big factor. Many of the leading industries relied on cotton cultivated with the labor of enslaved persons from the South. And so there was a lot of vested interests in the city at the time in perpetuating this, even if many expressed their opposition to the practice. And Mayor Lyman, really, I think, represented sort of the city side, the establishment side in this, although he, again, was someone that had spoken out against the practice of slavery and as a younger man had written about it. But he was sort of put in the role. I mean, I guess he becomes the bad guy in a sense, and that he was unable to stand up to the mob. He was unable to protect the women that were and men that were there that day. And so I think his role is he did not shine on that day, I shall say. He did a lot of other things subsequent to that in a benevolent way, but on that particular day, I think he fell short.
What was it like to research this book compared to Town Massacre? Was it a similar process?
Yeah. So the nice thing, Kevin, well, number one, this book, everything takes place here in Boston and Massachusetts, so that made a little bit easier for me. Especially during a pandemic, because for the first book, I had to travel down to Baltimore a few times to go in person to the libraries and such. But one of the great things, I guess, this is a good plug for our libraries, because one of the, during COVID, a lot of things were closed, but, the Boston Public Library has a fantastic website called Digital Commonwealth that has a ton of resources that are digitized. So thousands of letters from this era still exist. Obviously, people wrote lots of letters in those days. We don't do that today, but they wrote letters, all the time. And so many of those letters have been preserved, thankfully, thanks to our library, our public libraries, and other historical societies. And so I was able to really do a lot of digging online through Digital Commonwealth, and reading hundreds and hundreds of letters from participants in the day's events. Some of them are, I have terrible handwriting myself, and some of them had some tricky handwriting to read. But once you, are able to discern that. They really do open up and tell the story in a way that you really wouldn't be able to tell without those firsthand accounts. So it was a lot easier. It was harder with COVID, with things being closed, but it was a lot easier because of the great resources that we have, from our libraries and our historical societies. Locally, I spent some time at the Abington Historical Society. They have some great resources that were helpful to my research. Obviously, I went to the Weymouth Public Library because Mariah Chapman, was from there, and they have some of her. They have a nice bust of her and her husband. So it was. It's a good plug for libraries. They play such a crucial role in many ways, but it's certainly, for historical research, were really invaluable to my work.
These two books are listed in the true crime genre, and that was just somewhat becoming a favorite category for you to pen books in.
Yeah, so that part of it, I don't have any control over that. So the publisher handles that. I would not probably put it in true crime. I mean, and they are true and they were crime, but it's not true crime in the sense that I think of. It's more of a historical narrative. But yeah, it's what that one of the things I've learned is sort of the art of publishing and how it works. And, it's not an easy thing to navigate, certainly for myself. I consider myself an amateur. But again, I do this, I donate all the money back. I just do this because I enjoy the ability to kind of dive into this and enjoy telling these stories that I think are, kind of neat stories that deserve to be told. And so that's how I approach things. I could never be an author for, as a vocation. I think that would be really challenging.
But here's the thing here. If I could just step in for half a second, for someone who you've written two books, your first book won the 2020 Baltimore History Prize, as they called it, a gripping account of how a Federalist editor risked his life to defend his anti-war views. I mean, you're getting accolades for, your research and your storytelling. That has to at least motivate you maybe to write more.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I was very pleased and honored by that. When you work on something for a long time, it's rewarding to see that, people appreciate it and enjoy it. And it is nice to hear feedback from folks. I've done a number of, sort of author talks. I did a bunch the first time, and then unfortunately we ran into COVID. And so a couple of them had to be postponed, and now I'm getting back to doing that as we're able to do that. And we've had some author talks around the South Shore, doing one in Whitman soon, and we'll be doing some in Boston as well. And that's been fun to kind of talk to folks and share the story, but also have conversations with people about this. And I do appreciate the feedback. And I try to take the approach as a former journalist myself of approaching history and to make it a very readable and engaging way. We don't need any more dry history with just lots of dates and stuff. I think we want to, bring it alive, and that's what I try to do. And in my research, I really try hard to find the small little details that kind of bring the story alive, like what it might have smelled like, or what the weather was like that day, or things like that can kind of bring the reader right into the action. And so I try to do that. Sometimes it's easier when there's more of an historical record. Sometimes it's more challenging. You have to really dig deep, but that's what I shoot for. And I'm glad that people generally think that I've succeeded. So.
And if you're just tuning in to this segment, we are speaking with Josh Cutler, State Representative Josh Cutler, who is also an author. We're talking about his new book, The Boston Gentlemen's Mob, Mariah Chapman and the Abolition Riot of 1835. We've even been throwing in about his first book from 2019, Town Massacre, and talking about that. You talk a little bit about getting feedback. What have you heard from folks? Have you seen anything? I know I was kind of doing a little bit of research, and some of the things that I came across was your newest book has been described as enjoyable and compelling, and well researched. How do you process that?
Well, that's great. I mean, when you're writing history, obviously the research is paramount, and getting it right is paramount. And so I try really hard to make sure, that I'm, triple checking everything. And so, that is pleasing to my ears to hear that, because I did really work hard to try to make sure that I'm accurate portraying everything. And sometimes, in the historical record, it leaves you wanting more. And so you have to really dig and find different ways to get information. But yeah, no, it's been great. I appreciate all the feedback people have, and, or criticism too. Certainly, funny little quick story, Kevin. I remember when I was doing the first book, I had a gentleman from Maryland who was very upset with me, who felt that the book title Town Massacre, that it wasn't a massacre because only one person had been killed, and that I shouldn't be using the term massacre. And he was very persistent that was incorrect. And I thought that given what had happened, that it was appropriate, but not everyone always agrees, and that's the beauty of things. We can agree, we can have these kind of fun discussions. So, but I'm appreciative of all that, and look forward to kind of doing some more author talks as we're now able to get out and about more. And I'm not sure what the next book project will be. I'm still working on this, getting the word out about the Boston Gentlemen's Mob, but perhaps there'll be a third one in the future.
I'm sure that you had all kinds of emotions when you held your first book in your hand, because again, that's something that you crafted. It's like a sculptor, and when they finally put the final, finishing touches on it, and they stand back and look at it and go, "Wow!" Or like what was it like to get your second book and hold it in your hand? Was it as fulfilling as the first time?
It is pretty cool, yeah, because you see, as the process is, you submit the manuscript, and then it goes through a review process and copy editing in various steps, and then you get like what's called a galley, typically, where you see sort of the semi-final result, where it looks the way it would look in the book with the pictures and the cut lines and the captions and everything, and you have one final chance to kind of review it and catch little small things. Yep. And then that's it. And then you have no ability to make it. So, but anyway, so you see that, so you kind of have a sense of what it's going to look like, because obviously the publisher, they make decisions about, the cover art and, where the images are going to be. And, I try to suggest things, but I don't, that's their sort of purview. But yeah, it is kind of cool. It's pretty cool when you get the book in your hands and can see it. I know, these days, a lot of people read things on ebook readers and such, but it's still pretty cool, I think, to have the book in your hand and I have a bunch of copies on my desk and to have that. So it's something I always, will appreciate.
Well, what do you hear from your colleagues or your constituents? Have you had some of your colleagues at the State House grab a copy and give you any feedback?
Yeah, it's funny on the first book, Kevin, Town Massacre. So we had I had an author talk scheduled at the State House Library, and a lot of my colleagues were gonna come, and in fact, the Speaker of the House at that time was gonna come, and I was all excited. It was gonna be great, and that was in March of 2020. So what happened?
Yes.
In fact, I think it was one of the first events that was canceled at that time, and so I wasn't able to do that, and hoping to be able to get back. But since then, obviously, I've written the second book. But yeah, no, I've been sharing with some of my colleagues, and it's fun to kind of talk about it, and some of my colleagues represent city of Boston, or areas where that are in the book, which is kind of cool as well. So appreciate and fun to colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So it's nice to have some kind of bipartisan conversation about it.
Anything I haven't asked you in regards to the new book, but you feel you want to at least share with the folks who are enjoying this segment?
Yeah, no, just I'm happy to, I really love, I've done a number of visits to local historical societies and councils on aging and so forth. And I'm always delighted to do that. If there are folks out there that, want to put something together like that, I think it's a fun way to kind of do a small event and share, and, happy to bring copies of the book. And it's a good way for some of our local historical societies to raise a little money for themselves too. So happy to do that. I have a website, Josh S. Cutler, as in my author website.com, where we have some info on the book and just upcoming events and such. So love to do that kind of stuff. I want to thank you for giving me a chance to share, talk about something, non-political, or at least political in the 19th century for a bit. It's a nice little change up.
And folks can get it anywhere that books are sold, or strictly Amazon?
No, it's at Barnes and Noble in Hingham and in Braintree, and then there's a couple local bookstores, and then obviously Amazon and Barnes and Noble, the websites, and available online as well. And Arcadia Publishing is the company that actually published the book. It's called The History Press is their imprint, but it's Arcadia Publishing, and so they have their own website as well.
Arcadia does a lot of history.
They do, yeah.
A lot of history pressings, right?
Yep, absolutely. They do.
Well, we want to thank you so much for your time and continued success on the trail of doing the author talks and meeting folks who've read your book.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate the time.
And we thank you for tuning in to today's author. We hope that our guest today has motivated you to possibly go out and grab a new book. Until our next conversation, have yourself a great day.